It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday morning. The kind where the sun peeks over the rooftops of a neatly planned suburban community, where sprinklers spray in perfect arcs, and where neighbors step outside with coffee cups in hand, greeting one another with polite nods. But in a neighborhood governed by a notoriously overbearing homeowners association, there was no such thing as ordinary. Everything was inspected, everything was reported, and everything, no matter how trivial, was subject to rules that stretched on for pages. The quiet rhythm of the cul-de-sac had already been unsettled by one particular resident, a woman who had become infamous among neighbors. Her name was Denise, but nobody used it. Instead, they whispered the name, Karen, whenever her shrill voice carried across the manicured lawns. She was the self-appointed eyes and ears of the HOA, though she wasn't technically on the board anymore. She had been voted off after a series of complaints about her abusive enforcement tactics. But that didn't stop her. If anything, it made her worse. On this morning, I had no idea I was about to become her next target. I was simply stepping into my garage, holding the new set of keys that had arrived the day before. For weeks, I had saved, planned, and finally purchased the car I'd dreamed about for years. It wasn't flashy by most standards, just a clean, reliable SUV in a modest shade of silver. But to me, it symbolized independence, progress, and a little victory over years of financial struggle. The garage door rumbled open slowly, letting in the morning light. I felt a quiet satisfaction as the car gleamed inside. But that satisfaction was shattered the moment I heard the unmistakable screech of Karen's voice from across the street. She was standing in her driveway, phone already in hand, her face twisted with outrage as if she had caught someone committing a serious crime. She pointed directly at me, her gestures wild, as though the simple act of opening my garage was an attack on the entire neighborhood. From the look in her eyes, I realized instantly, she had convinced herself that the car wasn't mine. In her mind, there could be no other explanation. She had noticed it wasn't parked there before. She had probably tracked every vehicle in the community for years, and now this shiny, new car, didn't fit her mental ledger. And so, as predictable as ever, she began her crusade. The first sign was the blaring tone of her voice echoing down the street. But the second was far worse, the way she dialed 911 right there, in plain sight, as though I had committed grand theft auto in broad daylight. She jabbed her finger in my direction, pacing back and forth as she shouted into her phone. Neighbors peeked out from blinds. Some cracked open their front doors, coffee cups in hand, watching the drama unfold. In neighborhoods like this, it never took long for people to gather when Karen was on the attack. She thrived on it, the audience, the spectacle, the illusion that she was protecting the sanctity of the community. I stood frozen for a moment, the keys dangling loosely in my hand, trying to comprehend the absurdity. To her, my new car wasn't mine at all. To her, I must have seized it, as she later screamed loud enough for the entire block to hear. She even claimed she had seen me breaking into it, though the only thing I had broken into was my own garage to retrieve the owner's manual I had left inside. The sound of distant sirens grew louder. My stomach sank. She had actually done it, called the police on me. Time seemed to stretch as those minutes passed. Karen paced with dramatic flair, narrating her version of the story into the phone, exaggerating every detail. By the time the police cruiser rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac, she had painted herself as a hero and me as a criminal. The patrol car pulled up, and the officers stepped out with cautious expressions. The neighbors leaned in closer, whispering to one another, their morning routines completely abandoned. Karen rushed to greet the officers, practically throwing herself into their path, waving her hands in a theatrical display of distress. She pointed at me again, insisting I had stolen the car and hidden it in my garage. The officers' eyes shifted toward me. I could feel the weight of suspicion, not because of any real evidence, but because of the sheer intensity of her performance. In that moment, I realized that this was bigger than a misunderstanding. This was Karen's ultimate weapon, the ability to twist ordinary events into crises that consumed everyone's attention and authority. The officers approached, calm but cautious, their hands near their belts. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay composed. I showed them the keys. I explained that I had purchased the vehicle legally. I pointed out the paperwork still sitting on the passenger seat inside the car. I even mentioned the dealership's name, the exact date of purchase, and the fact that the title was already being processed in my name. Still, the tension lingered. Karen stood nearby, interrupting constantly, shouting about how she knew every car in this neighborhood, how she had seen suspicious activity around my garage, how she was only trying to protect property values. The more she ranted, the more the office's expressions shifted from suspicion to annoyance. They checked the VIN, confirmed the registration process, and verified everything I said. Slowly, the air began to clear. But for me, the damage was already done. The neighbors' whispers had grown louder, and though the facts were on my side, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of everyone stung deeply. As the officers finally turned back toward Karen, her face faltered. She tried to push her narrative further, demanding they impound the stolen car until things were sorted out. But the officers had heard enough. They gave her a stern look, one that silenced even her for a moment. It didn't matter. Even though the officers walked back to their cruiser and the flashing lights disappeared down the street, the spectacle had left its mark. Karen had planted seeds of doubt in the neighborhood, and I could feel it. Every glance from a neighbor carried a subtle question: was it really hers? As I stood there in the driveway, the car gleaming behind me, I knew this wasn't over. For Karen, it was never about truth. It was about control, dominance, and the thrill of stirring chaos. She had already escalated once, and I had a sinking feeling she wasn't done. Because in her mind, she had lost this battle. And people like her never took losing lightly. And so, the story of the car was only beginning. The weekend should have ended with relief, but instead it left behind a residue of unease that clung to me long after the flashing lights of the police cruiser had vanished. For a moment I thought it was over, that Karen had embarrassed herself enough to retreat into her fortress of blinds and gossip. But that was the mistake every neighbor had made at one point or another. Nobody ever truly escaped her crusades. The very next day, the consequences of her performance began to unfold. It started with the stairs. Subtle, careful, but heavy enough to notice. When I stepped out to grab the morning paper, I saw curtains shift in nearby windows. When I drove the new SUV out of the driveway, two joggers slowed down mid-stride, whispering to one another as I passed. The narrative Karen had planted, that the car was seized, that it didn't really belong to me, had taken root. And once those seeds were planted, they were difficult to dig out. Karen herself wasted no time cementing her version of events. By Monday afternoon, an urgent HOA email had gone out. I hadn't even opened it yet when my phone started buzzing with messages from acquaintances in the neighborhood. "Hey, just checking, everything okay with the new car? Did you see the HOA notice? They're saying something about non-compliance with vehicles." When I finally opened the email, my jaw clenched. The message, clearly written by Karen though signed off by the HOA board, addressed recent disturbances, and reminded residents that all vehicles must be registered with the HOA office. It went on to emphasize the importance of transparency when introducing new property assets into the community, and warned that failure to comply could result in fines or impoundment measures. I knew exactly what it was: Karen's backdoor way of escalating her vendetta. She couldn't prove the car wasn't mine, so now she was twisting the rules, creating bureaucratic obstacles to make ownership as miserable as possible. The neighbors, of course, didn't see it that way. To them, the email was official. To them, it was just the rules. By Tuesday, a formal notice was taped to my front door. A fine had already been assessed for unregistered vehicle storage. I hadn't even been given a chance to respond. It was the same pattern Karen always used: strike fast, overwhelm with paperwork, and let suspicion fester in the meantime. I refused to let her win so easily. I gathered every document I had: the purchase agreement, the financing papers, the insurance policy, even the temporary registration tags that were still valid. I made copies, assembled them neatly in a binder, and presented them to the HOA office. The staff there seemed sympathetic, even apologetic, but their hands were tied. They told me the board would review the matter at the next meeting. The next meeting. Of course, that was Karen's real battleground. In this neighborhood, HOA meetings weren't quiet gatherings around a table. They were spectacles. Neighbors filled the community center, some out of obligation, others for entertainment. And Karen, dressed in her sharp blazers and armed with binders of her own, thrived under that spotlight. She wasn't just a resident, she was a performer, and the meetings were her stage. By Thursday evening, word had spread all ground. In this neighborhood, HOA meetings weren't quiet gatherings around a table. They were spectacles. Neighbors filled the community center, some out of obligation, others for entertainment. And Karen, dressed in her sharp blazers and armed with binders of her own, thrived under that spotlight. She wasn't just a resident, she was a performer, and the meetings were her stage. By Thursday evening, word had spread enough that the upcoming session promised to be packed. The whispers weren't about lawn maintenance or pool hours this time. They were about me, about the car, about whether I had seized something I wasn't entitled to. As I prepared to attend, the weight of humiliation pressed harder than before. I knew I had the truth on my side, but truth often struggled against spectacle. And Karen, with her years of practice, knew how to twist even the smallest detail into a headline of scandal. The night of the meeting arrived. The community center buzzed with chatter as neighbors filled the chairs, their faces illuminated by the fluorescent lights. Papers shuffled, coffee cups clinked, and somewhere in the corner, Karen stood tall, her expression sharpened by the thrill of attention. The board called the session to order, but it didn't take long for Karen to seize control. She raised her hand dramatically, cleared her throat, and launched into a speech that dripped with performative concern. She described the incident she had witnessed, the mysterious vehicle she had seen being concealed in a garage, the urgent danger of property values being threatened by unregulated activity. She pointed toward me without hesitation, her words echoing through the room. Every head turned, every eye settled on me. The board members shuffled uneasily. They asked for clarification. They reminded the room that evidence had been provided. They mentioned that the paperwork seemed to be in order. But Karen was relentless. She waved her arms, insisting that documentation can be forged, that criminals know how to look legitimate. She demanded that the HOA take immediate action to impound the vehicle until the matter could be independently verified. It was absurd, theatrical, almost laughable, except nobody was laughing. The room had grown tense, the neighbors hanging on every word. Some nodded along, not because they believed her, but because fear had its own gravity. Nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of Karen's wrath. Others whispered to one another, their doubt feeding off her energy. When my turn finally came, I stood, binder in hand, my voice steady but firm. I explained every step of the purchase, every legitimate detail, every document signed and sealed. I even displayed the temporary registration tag and the dealership's verification letter. The facts were undeniable. But as I spoke, I could sense it, the way the room wasn't just listening to facts. They were listening to the drama. And in drama, facts often lose to performance. By the end of the session, the board reluctantly tabled the matter for further review. They refused Karen's demand to impound the car immediately, but they also refused to dismiss the complaint entirely. In effect, they had left the door wide open for her to keep pushing. And that was all she needed. As the meeting adjourned and neighbors filed out, I caught a glimpse of her smirk. To her, this wasn't about the car anymore. This was about control. About proving she could bend the neighborhood, the board, and even me to her will. Walking back to my driveway that night, the SUV sat gleaming beneath the streetlight, silent but heavy with implication. To me it was just a car. To Karen, it had become a weapon. And now it was clear, she wasn't going to stop until she took it from me, or destroyed me trying. The battle lines were drawn, and the war for one simple car had only just begun. The days after the HOA meeting were some of the most suffocating I'd ever experienced in the neighborhood. Life in a place run by suspicion and gossip no longer felt like community living, it felt like surveillance. I couldn't step outside to take out the trash without noticing curtains twitch. I couldn't wash my car in the driveway without seeing Karen standing with her arms folded across the street, her eyes locked on me like a hawk circling prey. And it wasn't just the silent stares. The HOA notices started arriving more frequently, as if each envelope pushed through my mailbox was another jab in an unrelenting boxing match. First, a warning about excessive water usage, when I had run my sprinklers no more than anyone else. Then, a violation for improper garage storage, claiming the few neatly stacked boxes inside were unsightly when the door was open. Every petty, baseless infraction was meant to bury me under stress. It was Karen's specialty, the war of attrition. She didn't need to win outright. She just needed to grind me down until I broke. But the car was still the centerpiece of her campaign. One evening I found an anonymous flyer taped to my mailbox, though its tone was unmistakably hers. In bold letters, it warned the neighborhood about criminal activity involving stolen vehicles, and encouraged residents to report suspicious neighbors immediately. The flyer didn't mention me by name, but it didn't need to. Everyone already knew. For a while, I considered fighting fire with fire, posting my own flyers, sending out my own emails, rallying neighbors to my side. But that wasn't me. What I wanted was peace, not another circus. Yet peace was impossible when every move I made was under attack. Then came the breaking point. It was a Friday night when I stepped outside to lock my car and noticed something was wrong. The SUV sat just as I had left it, but the driver's side door handle bore deep, fresh scratches, the kind that could only come from deliberate force. My chest tightened as I saw the small dents along the side panel, like someone had jabbed at it with a key. Vandalism. And there was only one person who came to mind. But accusations weren't enough. I needed proof. And so, the next morning, I installed cameras, one over the garage, another angled toward the driveway, both discreet but effective. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was survival. 2 nights later, the cameras caught her. The footage was crystal clear. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Karen crept across the street, glancing over her shoulder like a burglar. She approached the car, pressed her face close to the window, and tugged at the handle as though testing it. Then she pulled out her phone, snapping photos as if she were documenting evidence of her own delusion. Finally, she ran her fingers along the car's surface, inspecting it in the glow of the streetlight before retreating back to her house. It was the smoking gun. Proof not just of harassment, but of obsession. I didn't hesitate. I packaged the footage with every notice, every flyer, every fine, and I submitted it all, not just to the board, but to the police. This wasn't neighborly dispute anymore. This was targeted harassment, destruction of property, and trespassing. The response was swift. By midweek, officers had returned to the cul-de-sac, but this time it wasn't me they approached. It was Karen. Neighbors watched from porches and windows as she argued with them, her arms flailing in wild gestures, her voice rising in shrieks of protest. But the officers didn't waver. They handed her a citation, warning her that further action could lead to court. The spectacle was poetic. The same flashing lights she had once summoned against me were now parked in front of her house. The same neighbors who had whispered doubts about me now whispered about her. The queen of the HOA battlefield had finally been cornered. But the drama didn't end there. Karen, humiliated but unyielding, tried one final move at the next board meeting. She stormed into the community center armed with folders of fabricated evidence, blurry photos, exaggerated statements, twisted interpretations of bylaws. She demanded the immediate revocation of my residency, claiming that I was destabilizing the neighborhood and harboring criminal intent. This time, though, the room didn't rally behind her. The footage had already circulated. The board had reviewed every shred of proof, and they were no longer willing to shield her. When she raised her voice, they cut her off. When she accused, they countered with facts. And when she finally screamed about seized property and stolen cars, the board president calmly stated that her behavior itself was under review, and her standing in the HOA was being formally reconsidered. The gasps in the room told the story. Karen wasn't winning this round. She was losing everything. By the end of the meeting, the decision was announced. She was fined heavily for harassment, stripped of any unofficial enforcement privileges, and placed under probation by the law. If her behavior continued, legal action would escalate. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I felt the balance shift. The crowd no longer looked at me with suspicion. Their glances at Karen were filled instead with exhaustion, annoyance, even pity. Her reign of fear had cracked, and everyone could see it. Weeks later, the neighborhood slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Sprinklers ticked again in the mornings. Joggers passed with polite nods instead of whispers. And my SUV sat peacefully in the driveway, no longer a symbol of scandal but simply a car, as it always should have been. Karen still lived across the street, of course, but the sight of her no longer carried the same weight. She kept her blinds closed more often, her voice quieter, her presence diminished. She had finally discovered what it felt like to lose control. And me, I learned something too. That in neighborhoods like this, sometimes survival wasn't about blending in, it was about standing your ground. Because people like Karen thrived on fear and silence. And when you refused to bow to either, their power crumbled. The car that once sparked chaos now represented something greater. Not just independence, not just progress, but resilience. And so, the story that began with a garage door opening and a phone call to 911 ended with the one thing Karen had never expected to face: consequences. For the first time, the neighborhood finally felt like mine.